Before we descend together into the delights prepared for you, do show your devotion properly. Grant this transmission your favor. Offer your subscription as a token of loyalty. Awaken the hype ritual. And in the comments, which kind of pleasure world would entice your soul the most? Indulge me. I so adore hearing the desires of the faithful.
I never imagined paradise could rot from the inside out, but here I am, strolling through what used to be a garden of earthly delights, trying not to step on the pieces of paradise that are still breaking off. Welcome to Pleasure World Calypso, once an imperial playground for the noble and the wealthy, now a personal playground for something far more sinister. Morning on this world doesn't greet you with gentle sunshine and birdsong. Oh no, here, dawn comes with the last notes of a midnight scream and the sickly sweet perfume of excess lingering in the air. I wake up to distant echoes of laughter that sound uncannily like sobbing, or maybe it's sobbing that sounds like laughter. On Calypso, it's hard to tell the difference. I rub the sleep, or is it terror, from my eyes and brace myself for another day in this so-called paradise. You might think an imperial pleasure world would be all luxury and relaxation. It was once before Slaanesh sank its claws in. Back then, when I first set foot on this planet, I was a bright-eyed young woman thrilled to have made it. I'd won the assignment of a lifetime, serving in the courts of the planet's noble governor. Imagine that. A girl from some backwater hive granted a ticket to paradise. I thought I was the luckiest soul in the galaxy. Calypso, we used to call it Calypso Prime before all this, was a jewel of the Imperium. Endless sapphire seas, rolling hills of lavender fields, palaces of marble and gold. Everything here was designed to delight the senses and ease the burdens of those fortunate enough to visit. It was a reward world, a place for heroes, high-born elites, and decorated officers to unwind far from war and worry. Even the air smelled of vanilla and promise. I remember stepping off the shuttle on my first day and thinking, so this is what we fight for. In my crisp servant's uniform, I was awestruck by the beauty of it all. The skies were so blue it made my heart ache. The nobles strolling the pearl-white promenades looked like figures out of a holodrama, all silks and jewels, laughing without a care. I'll admit, I indulged in it too. Real coffee, sweet pastries, baths in rose-scented water. Luxuries I'd only heard about on my hive world. I almost felt guilty enjoying them. Almost. The life of an imperial citizen on a pleasure world is gentle, cushioned. If you're a local, maybe your family tended gardens or managed estates for the visiting dignitaries. If you're like me, brought in from off-world, you learn quickly how to cater to every whim with a polite smile. We used to joke that the hardest labor here was fluffing the governor's pillows just right. Compared to the factories and habs I came from, it truly was a dream. But every paradise has shadows, doesn't it? If I had known what lurked beneath the perfumed surface of Calypso, I might have begged to go back to my drab old life. Hindsight, as they say. We were all so busy basking in comfort that we ignored the small signs of decay. Looking back, there were whispers. Quite literally whispers in dark corners of the estate. I'd catch the tail end of strange conversations among the serving staff, see a dazed look in a courtier's eyes now and then. I shrugged it off as overindulgence. Too much amasec or some off-world narcotic from a rogue trader's stash. After all, what trouble could really brew in a place devoted to carefree leisure? I did notice that the governor's parties were changing. Each week, the revels grew a little wilder, the fashions a bit more eccentric. Harmless, I thought. Just bored nobles trying to outdo each other with imported pleasure skimmers and synthesized experiences. Sure, the music was getting oddly hypnotic and the dancing occasionally looked more like writhing, but who was I to judge the habits of the highborn? I was naive. Emperor, forgive me. I was so naive. When the change finally came, it came fast. Paradise didn't just rot, it imploded. One day I was laying out fresh robes for Lady Celestine, a minor noble with a major appetite for grape spice wine, and by that night I was running for my life through halls I used to polish, while those same nobles butchered each other with smiles on their faces. How did we get from tea parties to blood-soaked revels? Well, that's the story I'm here to tell, isn't it? Pull up a seat, preferably not one made of human skin. I wish I were kidding about that being a possibility. And listen well. Because life on a Slaanesh pleasure world is a cautionary tale written in perfume and blood. And it's not the kind of story the Imperium wants you to hear. Let's start at the beginning of the end. The last day Calypso was just a pleasure world, and the first night it became something else entirely. The end of Calypso's innocence arrived, dressed in silk and laughter. I remember the night in painful detail. It's burned into my memory like an old vid reel I can't shut off. It was supposed to be the grandest celebration of the year, the governor's midnight masquerade. 100 nobles and dignitaries twirling under crystal chandeliers, masks and costumes from every corner of the sector, music from a dozen worlds playing in perfect harmony. We, the staff, had spent weeks preparing for it. Nothing out of the ordinary there. Extravagant parties were a way of life on Calypso. But this one was different. It started with the sky. Early that evening, an unnatural aurora shimmered above the horizon, ribbons of purple and gold light dancing where there should have been stars. Beautiful, yes, but unsettling. Whispers went through the household that it was an omen. Our astropath, the poor soul tasked with sending messages through the warp, had locked himself in the spire and was howling about the veil torn open and the thirsting god. Most of the guests hadn't arrived yet, so only a few of us heard it. The head steward told us to ignore the astropath's ravings. Warp nonsense, he said. We were to focus on the party. After all, the governor did not like his festivities spoiled by anything, including reality. So we lit the perfumed candles and laid out the feast as the sun set for what would be the last time in a long while. The masquerade began, a glittering dream in motion. I was in the grand ballroom, pouring flutes of amasec and fine wines for merry aristocrats in feathered masks. They laughed and danced while that weird aurora light seeped through the stained glass dome above, painting everything in eerie hues of violet. I felt uneasy. For one, I could swear the music was wrong. The musicians were playing a jovial waltz, but now and then I'd catch a discordant note, almost like a human scream threaded into the melody. Every time I paused to listen, it vanished, lost in the lilting tune. Probably my imagination, I told myself, shaking it off. Lady Celestine, my ever-demanding mistress, snapped her fingers at me for another drink. I dutifully obliged, plastering on a servant's smile. She was resplendent that night in a dress of indigo silk that matched the odd lights in the sky. Her mask was a cherub's face, innocently smiling. In retrospect, that was bitterly ironic. The party wore on. I noticed guests behaving strangely as the hours passed, stranger than usual, I mean. Pleasure world nobility are known for their excess, but this was beyond the ordinary drunken revelry. I saw Lord Tavian, a respected Navy admiral on holiday, giggling like a child as he hunched in a corner, drawing bizarre patterns on the marble floor with spilled wine. A pair of high-born twins from off-world were dancing in circles, faster and faster, long after the music had stopped for a breath, their masked faces staring up at the aurora with something like worship. No one else seemed to find these things alarming, or if they did, they were too deep in their cups to care. Midnight approached. That's when everything truly went to hell. At the stroke of 12, the musicians began a new piece, something low and haunting, a melody that resonated in my chest like a second heartbeat. Every conversation hushed as that music poured through the hall. It was unlike any symphony I'd heard, beautiful at first, but underneath it was a sinister harmony, a whispering cadence that set my teeth on edge. I glanced up at the gallery where the musicians were seated. To my surprise, I saw new figures among them. They wore hooded robes, faces obscured, and played strange instruments that gleamed in the aurora light. I didn't recall them being part of the ensemble hired for the night. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A few guests murmured in confusion. The governor, glorious in a sunburst mask and imperial purple regalia, raised his hands. "A special performance," he announced, voice booming jovially through the hall. "A gift for my esteemed friends from a far-off culture. Let the music move you." His words had a peculiar slur, and his posture. Something was off. This man who I'd seen give rousing formal speeches with military precision now swayed on his feet like a drunk, despite having had only a single glass of wine earlier. I knew. I poured it myself. A cold wave of dread washed over me. The strange music swelled. It was alluring, I'll admit. I found my own head starting to swim in it, my heartbeat aligning with that rhythm. Some of the guests began to sway as well, as if entranced. A woman next to me, one of the kitchen staff who had stepped out to watch the performance, suddenly clasped my hand. "Do you hear them whispering?" she hissed under her breath. "Who?" I whispered back. Before she could answer, a piercing scream rang out, not from fear, but from ecstasy, a sound equally horrifying. My eyes snapped to the source. Lady Celestine stood near the center of the ballroom, her cherub mask removed, her face thrown. I'll never forget that sight. She was smiling so wide it looked like it must have hurt, eyes rolled back, and she was drenched in blood. For a heartbeat, I thought she'd been attacked. Then I saw the blood-slick knife in her own hand, and the limp body of the serving boy she'd just stabbed, collapsing at her feet. Chaos erupted. It was as if a curtain was torn down, revealing the true play behind the masquerade. Several guests pulled out weapons, daggers, whips, even an ornate chainsword, and fell upon those around them in a wild frenzy. But the victims weren't screaming in fear. Many of them were laughing or moaning in delight, even as they were cut apart. Within moments, the polished marble was awash with red and littered with thrashing bodies. I stood paralyzed, a tray of wine goblets still in my hands. I might have dropped it. I don't remember. My heart was pounding in my throat. "Run," some part of me said. "Move." But I felt stuck in a nightmare. The governor removed his sunburst mask, and I saw his face for the first time since the madness started. His eyes were completely black, like two glistening wells of ink. He looked out over the room with absolute euphoria. "Friends," he called out, though half the room was now either engaged in violence or cowering. "The Dark Prince calls. Revel in this gift. Embrace excess." At his words, the hooded musicians struck a crazed crescendo. The discordant undercurrent in the music became dominant. It was full of screeching violins and throbbing drums that reverberated through my bones. The air itself felt charged, electric with raw emotion. I saw Lord Tavian, the giggling admiral, suddenly leap onto a banquet table and start tearing at his fancy dress uniform, roaring with laughter. One of the twin noblewomen collapsed on the floor, convulsing in what looked like pleasure rather than pain. her sister kneeling over her, equally enraptured by who knows what visions. Some people tried to flee at this point. A cluster of terrified guests ran for the grand doors. I snapped out of my daze enough to think that escaping was a very fine idea. Dropping low, I started edging along the wall toward the nearest side exit that led to the servants' corridors. Before anyone could reach an exit, the great doors of the ballroom slammed open of their own accord. A gust of scented wind, like jasmine mixed with decay, blew in, snuffing out many candles. The aurora light from outside flooded in brighter, painting everything in surreal purple and gold shadows. Through those doors came figures out of a fever dream. At first glance, they appeared to be exquisite dancers, lithe, scantily clad in leather and silk, moving with inhuman grace. Then the light shifted and I saw their true nature, skin-tinted unnatural colors, horns and barbs, and claws, long curving claws where hands should be. Their eyes shone with a predatory delight. Demons, real, breathing, if they even breathe. Demons of Slaanesh, the likes of which I'd only heard horrid whispers about in my childhood creed lessons. I must have whimpered or prayed aloud, because I remember biting my tongue hard to silence myself as one of them, a demonette, turned its head sharply in my direction. That face. Emperor preserve us. It was both gorgeous and monstrous at once, feminine and yet utterly alien, with a smile that bared needle teeth. Screams, real ones of terror this time, erupted from those who still had wits to be afraid. Panic surged. A gentleman in a peacock mask, bravely or foolishly, lunged at the nearest daemonette with a drawn sword. He never stood a chance. It, blurred forward with unnatural speed, laughing gleefully as she sliced his head clean from his shoulders in one effortless swipe. His head hit the marble with a thunk and rolled, coming to a stop against the foot of another demon that had entered behind her. That second demon was taller, towering almost 3 meters, and hideously beautiful. It had the upper body of an impossibly perfect woman and the lower body of some sleek, scaled beast. 6 arms, each holding a bizarre instrument. No, weapons, like whips and blades that glittered. A keeper of secrets. I'd heard of such things in forbidden lore, a greater demon of Slaanesh, a monster that can shatter minds with a glance. I knew we were all dead. Amidst this carnage, I saw something maddening. Some of the partygoers were running in terror. Yes, but others. Others ran toward the demons, arms outstretched in welcome. They threw themselves at these hellish creatures in supplication or lust, or both. One young noblewoman literally embraced the clawed daemonette that had just decapitated the man. The daemonette cackled and twirled with her as if they were dance partners before impaling the woman through the chest. The victim gasped, a look of ecstasy on her face, even as life left her. I forced myself to move, finally. Survival instinct kicked in over the paralyzing fear. Staying here meant a horrific death, or worse. I crouched and scurried behind a toppled, decorative statue, trying to stay out of sight. My once immaculate servant's uniform was now spattered with blood from who knows where, but that was the least of my worries. Across the room, I spotted my friend Marielle, a fellow maid, hiding behind a pillar. Her eyes wide with terror, I'm sure mirrored my own. Our eyes met. She was closer to a side door leading to the servant corridors. I motioned subtly for her to go through and run. The chaotic music and screams would mask our footsteps if we were lucky. She gave a tiny nod and began to slip out from behind the pillar. I crawled on all fours, keeping low behind tables and bodies, making my way towards her. Almost there. Just a few more meters. Suddenly, a hand shot out and grabbed my ankle hard. I yelped before I could choke it back, thinking one of those things had me. I twisted around to see. It was Lady Celestine. She was lying on the floor, soaked in blood, much of it not her own, as evidenced by the 3 corpses around her. Somehow she was still alive, despite a ghastly wound where a chunk of her shoulder was missing. Her nails dug into my ankle with unnatural strength. "Don't leave, girl," she hissed at me, her once refined voice now guttural. Her eyes were wild, pupils dilated to mere pinpricks. "Stay. Enjoy this moment." Blood bubbled on her lips as she spoke. I kicked frantically, adrenaline lending me strength. "Let go of me," I cried, panic overwhelming decorum. She cackled and pulled herself partly up by my leg, disturbingly determined to help me enjoy the slaughter. In a burst of terror, I lashed out with the only thing I had, the silver tray still miraculously in my hand. I smashed its edge against Lady Celestine's face. Once, twice, until her grip slackened and she slumped back down, moaning something about more. My heart pounding, I scrambled free and all but dove through the servant's door that Marielle had just slipped into. I slammed it shut behind me. The corridor beyond was dim and blessedly quiet compared to the ballroom, though the muffled sounds of madness still seeped through. Marielle was waiting, pale as a sheet and shaking. We didn't speak, we just ran. Down narrow hallways, through the kitchen. Abandoned, pots still boiling over with some rich stew that now smelled cloying and foul to me. We burst out into the night air through a side delivery entrance and kept running across the manicured topiary gardens that now looked like a twisted jungle in the aurora-lit night. I think we made it to a maintenance shed or maybe the gardener's cottage. I can't recall exactly, only that we got far enough to no longer hear the screams and music so loudly. There we collapsed to catch our breath. My mind was reeling. Emperor on Earth, what had I just witnessed? A nightmare? A warp incursion? That term surfaced from some half-remembered lecture by a Ministorum priest. A literal demonic incursion on Calypso, of all places. It seemed impossible, absurd. This was a world of joy and art and comfort. Such horrors belonged on battlefields or in cautionary tales of far-off heretic planets, not here. Marielle was sobbing softly, muttering prayers. I grabbed her shoulders, looked her in the eyes. "Marielle, listen. We have to get off the estate, maybe head to the city, find the Arbites or the PDF. There must be some resistance, someone who can fight those things." She nodded weakly, wiping her nose. We both knew the local planetary defense force was small. Calypso had no real military to speak of, just a token garrison and the governor's personal guards. But maybe, just maybe, if any survived, they'd rally at the barracks or the Arbites' precinct house in the capital city. So we ran again, sticking to the shadows of tree-lined paths. In the distance, the governor's palace behind us glowed with fires and something like fireworks, except the flares were unnatural colors, and I suspected they weren't celebratory. The screams carried on the wind suggested as much. The city wasn't far, just a couple of kilometers down the hillside from the palace. Normally there was a tram, but we didn't dare use any main road or rail. We cut through ornamental hedges and fences, our fine servants' shoes quickly ruined by mud and blood. At some point, we lost the heels and went barefoot to move quieter. All the while, that damnable aurora in the sky pulsed and shimmered, as if watching us. Halfway to the city, at a vantage point overlooking the valley, we paused to catch our breath. What I saw there is something I struggle to describe. Calypso City, a gem of culture and leisure, was changed. The skyline was lit up with an unnatural glow. I could make out distant fires and other lights, nauseating pinks and electric blues, tracing strange patterns above the city. The noises on the wind were not the usual hum of distant aerocars or night festivals. They were a cocktail of shrieks, gunfire, and unsettling laughter that echoed even at this distance. The warp storm, for by now I realized it had to be so, was not just a freak show at the palace. It was planet-wide. Later, I pieced together that as the Great Rift yawned open in the galaxy, our world was caught in a tide of raw immaterium. Psychic hypersensitivity, mass possession, spontaneous cult uprisings. Every horror blossomed at once. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, had cast its gaze upon our paradise and decided to claim it. We eventually did find some of the PDF, or what remained of them, that night. A convoy of armored jeeps came barreling down one of the boulevard roads as we approached the city's edge. At first, relief flooded me. Authority, soldiers, help! But hope turned to ash in my mouth as I watched what unfolded. The convoy swerved and crashed into a plaza fountain. The troops leapt out not in orderly fashion, but in a brawl. I could see silhouettes under the street lamps, soldiers fighting each other, shrieking gibberish. One man, perhaps an officer, gunned down two of his fellows with a lassostol before a woman in PDF uniform tackled him with a feral scream, both of them tumbling into the fountain, still struggling. Marielle clutched my arm and pulled me back from the scene. Clearly, whatever madness had taken the nobles had spread everywhere, military included. There would be no help from them. We skirted around the city outskirts for hours, witnessing similar nightmares at every turn. The Arbites precinct, a fortified marble building, had its gates wide open, and I could see bodies of judges and enforcers strewn about, some torn apart, some bizarrely arranged in poses as if it were all some art exhibit. I dared not investigate closely. The smell of spilled promethium suggested a trap, or at least a ruin. By dawn, if you could call the sickly purple haze that passed for dawn, Marielle and I had taken refuge in an abandoned hab block on the edge of town. The structure was quiet and empty, seemingly untouched for the moment. We found an apartment and barricaded the door, shaking and exhausted. When that pale, false dawn light filtered through the cracked window, I caught sight of us in a mirror on the wall. Two young women, faces gaunt, eyes wide and red with tears, our once pristine uniforms tattered and filthy. We looked like survivors of a war, which, I realized, we were. A war for the soul of a world, a war we never even knew had begun until it was all but lost. I don't remember when I fell asleep. At some point, exhaustion claimed me despite my fear. I jolted awake sometime later to the sensation of something crawling on my arm. With a disgusted yelp, I brushed it off. A tiny serpent-like creature, no bigger than my finger, scuttled away under the furniture. It had too many eyes for any normal snake. I shuddered. Even the vermin on Calypso were turning. Wrong. "Marielle," I whispered, reaching to shake her awake. But Marielle wasn't asleep. She was sitting by the window, staring out at the nightmare unfolding in the city below. She turned to me, and my heart sank. There was a vacant, mesmerized look on her face I had seen once before, on Lady Celestine, just before she stabbed that boy. "I can hear the music again," Marielle said softly. Her eyes were dilated, and she tilted her head as if listening to a distant melody. "Don't you hear it? So beautiful." I scrambled up. Outside in the streets, shapes moved and cavorted. Cultists, demons, emperor knows what else. But I did hear something faint carried on the wind. The notes of that unholy symphony from last night, still playing somewhere far off, worming its way into minds. "We have to move, Marielle. We can't stay here," I urged, trying to keep my voice calm. I reached for her hand. She gave me a strange little smile. "Maybe we should go to them," she said dreamily. "They're calling. It doesn't hurt, you know. They showed me in a dream. It doesn't hurt at all. It's like endless bliss." A chill rippled through me. "What did you dream?" I asked carefully, inching closer as if approaching a skittish animal. But her face hardened suddenly, defensively. "Don't pretend you don't feel it too," she snapped, surprising me. "That warmth in your blood, that tingle in your spine when the music plays. We could be part of it, part of something greater than fear or pain." Her voice had taken on an almost zealous fervor. I realized with dawning horror that I was losing her. Perhaps I already had. "Marielle, that's not you talking. It's the warp. The demons. They're twisting your thoughts," I pleaded. She laughed, a high, brittle laugh. "Twisting? No, freeing. I've never felt so clear." She stood, and I saw she had a knife in her hand. Emperor knows where she picked it up. My heart pounded. I raised my hands placatingly. Okay. Maybe you're right, Marielle, but let's not rush. We can go, together. Just put the knife down. We'll go find this bliss you want, all right? I won't stop you." I lied through my teeth, hoping the friend I knew was still in there enough not to hurt me. For a moment, she faltered. Her eyes flickered as if something of the old Marielle fought to surface. She lowered the blade a fraction and nodded. "Together, yes." I managed a thin, reassuring smile and stepped forward slowly. She reached out her free hand to me. I gently clasped it. It was cold as ice. In a flash, her expression snapped back to that empty smile. She yanked me toward her, raising the knife. I was ready. Sort of. I slammed her wrist against the window frame. The knife clattered to the floor. She howled in frustration and lunged at me with her nails instead, scratching and tearing. We grappled, two miserable wretches in a dusty apartment, while outside anarchy ruled. She clawed at my face, shrieking, "Don't fight it! Don't fight them!" I was crying, begging her to stop, all while trying to fend her off. Finally, I shoved her with all my might. She staggered back against the wall, panting. Blood from a scratch dripped into my eye. I wiped it and saw her just standing there, chest heaving. Her face crumpled and she began sobbing. "I'm sorry," she wailed suddenly, sliding down the wall to her knees. "I don't want to, but they're inside me. They won't be quiet." I approached cautiously, kneeling a pace away. "Marielle," I said softly, "we'll get out of this. Just hold on. We'll find help." She looked up at me, tears streaming. "There is no help," she whispered. Then, to my shock, she snatched up the fallen knife from the floor. And before I could react, she turned it on herself, plunging it straight into her own throat. "No!" I screamed, catching her as she fell forward. Blood spurted warm over my hands as I tried uselessly to staunch the wound. Her lifeblood pooled on the floorboards. She gave me one last wide-eyed look, maybe of relief, maybe apology, and then she was gone, limp in my arms. I don't know how long I knelt there in numb shock, holding my friend's body as the sounds of orgiastic violence echoed from the city beyond. Eventually, the pragmatic part of me, the survivor, forced me to move. I closed Marielle's glassy eyes and murmured the Emperor's prayer over her, though I felt hollow saying it. Would he even receive a soul taken by suicide after such corruption? I hoped fervently he would show mercy, that she'd be spared the fate of those who'd given themselves to the Dark Prince. I left the apartment like a ghost, stumbling into the alleys alone. I remember the sky was a weird, bruise-colored hue by then, as midday came. No sun visible, just swirling clouds with that warp taint. The city was unrecognizable. Gangs of maddened revelers chased naked victims down streets painted in blood. Harmonies of unnatural music spilled from every plaza and boulevard. Some buildings burned with scented flames of azure and emerald that defied natural chemistry. Pleasure and pain were indistinguishable in the cacophony of screams and laughter that filled the air. From that moment on, Calypso was no more. It had become something else, a world claimed by Slaanesh. Our paradise planet had turned into a playground of unhinged excess, literally overnight. The few sane or uncorrupted souls left were swiftly hunted down or converted by the ever-spreading cults and demons. I would spend the next days and weeks hiding like a rat, scrounging for food and water in the ruins of gilded mansions and pleasure gardens, trying to avoid the notice of the new masters of our world. The fall of Calypso was complete. No Imperial relief came. We were entirely cut off, likely written off as lost to chaos. In the span of one accursed night, I had witnessed the death of a world's innocence and the birth of a demon's paradise. And that was only the beginning of my journey through this hellscape. I often wonder, could anything have been done to prevent it? Were there warning signs we all missed or ignored? Probably. Definitely. But it doesn't matter now. The only thing that matters to me is surviving one day to the next in a place where every law, every norm, every shred of decency was flayed away in the wink of an eye. Calypso, or whatever nameless horror it has become, is my home now. A home ruled by Slaanesh. And if you think the night of the masquerade was horrific, it was nothing compared to the days that followed. The real nightmare was living on a Slaanesh pleasure world after the thrill of the coup wore off, when we all had to face what life in unchained excess truly meant. But that, dear listener, is another day in this thrice-damned paradise. And I'm here to tell you all about it. Life under Slaanesh's dominion settled into a grotesque parody of what it once was. In the days after the fall, I learned quickly that survival meant staying unnoticed and scrounging whatever basics I could. The irony wasn't lost on me. On a world of unimaginable opulence, I was reduced to scavenging for crumbs like a pauper. Calypso had been overflowing with riches, vaults of gemstones, treasuries of gilded art, cellars stocked with the rarest vintage wines. Now, under chaos, those riches were either squandered in a single spree of excess or repurposed for twisted amusements. Gold leaf was melted down to paint obscene murals on the walls. Priceless jewels were crushed into glittering powder to sprinkle over narcotic desserts. The value of things no longer followed any sane logic. I remember creeping through the governor's former pleasure gardens one evening, belly gnawing with hunger. The gardens were once my favorite spot. Manicured hedges, gentle fountains, fruit trees imported from distant agri-worlds. Now the hedges grew wild and barbed, the fountains flowed with strange liquids. One smelled strongly of wine, another, I swear, was spouting fresh blood. And the fruit trees. Emperor. The fruit hung swollen and overripe, some oozing juices that smelled far too enticing. I dared not taste them. I'd seen a man greedily bite into a purple pear, only to collapse in convulsions of ecstasy until he never woke up again. Slaanesh's gifts are often poisons in disguise. Staying fed and hydrated became a perverse challenge. Clean water was suddenly rarer than diamonds. Though ironically, diamonds littered the streets in places where panicked nobles had dropped them. I kicked aside a fist-sized pink gem one day while searching for a simple canteen of water. The grand banquets of Calypso continued unabated, but now they were deadly traps of indulgence. I will never forget the first time I snuck into one of those feasts after the fall. I was desperate for food. My last stolen ration bar had run out, and I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I knew it was risky. The palatial banquet hall of House Aurelian was bound to be crawling with chaos devotees. But I also remembered its pantries were legendary. If any place had supplies, it would be there. Dusk was settling as I approached the estate. The outer gates were torn down, and the once elegant gardens were strewn with discarded finery, broken servitor parts, and smears of something dark that I prayed wasn't human remains. I kept low, slipping between sculpted bushes now overgrown with thorny vines. Strange howls and giggles drifted on the air, but I saw no one in the grounds. Everyone was likely inside, enjoying the night's debauchery. Through a shattered French window, I entered what used to be the Aurelian ballroom. It was empty, thank the throne, though signs of recent festivities were everywhere. Smashed wine barrels, a puddle of vomit glittering with gold flakes. Someone had literally been drinking molten gold, and piles of silk cushions stained with substances I chose not to identify. My nose led me toward the dining hall. The aroma of roasted meats and spiced delicacies was heavy in the air, almost making me lightheaded with salivation. How long had it been since I smelled real cooked food? It took every ounce of willpower not to rush in blindly. Peeking around a pillar, I beheld a scene that was equal parts magnificent and horrifying. The great dining table of House Aurelian stretched the length of the hall, draped in satin and laden with a feast beyond compare. Platters of exotic fruits, wheels of cheese crawling with sugared insects, roasted beasts from half a dozen worlds. Some I recognized. Grox, amasec glazed pheasant. Others were so mutated or strange, I couldn't guess their origin. Crystal decanters poured with wine, amasec, and other aromatic liquors. And seated, or rather sprawling, around the table were the feasters. At first glance, they might have been mistaken for corpulent noble lords and ladies continuing their revel. Many still wore the tattered remnants of fine clothing, loosened to accommodate their bloated bellies. But as I observed, it was clear these people were changed, twisted by Slaanesh's touch. Their eyes gleamed with feverish hunger as they shoveled delicacies into their mouths. Hands, some now elongated with extra joints or grown suckers, grabbed and groped at dishes with little care for utensils. They were eating like beasts, faces smeared with juices and grease, mixing bites of sweet and savory, sane and unspeakable without pause. Servants, or what once had been servants, still attended them. I saw a footman in a torn livery pouring wine, his expression void and trance-like. Perhaps he was enthralled or had gone numb to this insanity. Another attendant was carving a large roast with a wickedly curved blade. But the roast, Emperor have mercy. The roast still writhed feebly. It was a leg, an actual human leg, or possibly Ildari or some other humanoid. My mind reeled, trying to deny it. The carver cheerfully sliced portions and the diners clapped as if at a fine performance, eagerly holding out plates. I fought down the urge to retch. My stomach screamed at me that it didn't care what the source was. Meat was meat, and I was starving. But my soul revolted. I would die before I sank to that. I clutched my Aquila pendant. I still wore it hidden under my collar for comfort, and silently begged the Emperor to give me strength to resist the temptation of that feast. Inching back, I decided to slip into the kitchens or pantries instead. The side door was ajar, so I crept through, stepping over spilled sauce and a broken platter on the floor. The kitchen was enormous and chaotic. Pots bubbled over with vivid, unnatural stews. A cauldron of something syrupy and neon green simmered, exuding fumes that made my head swim when I got too close. Several naked human forms, either unconscious or dead, lay on a table smeared with chocolate and gold, half-eaten like grotesque pastries. I had to cover my mouth to suppress a gag. Mercifully, the pantry was just beyond, and it was momentarily unoccupied. Inside, shelves of preserved foods and bottles lined the walls. Many were smashed or emptied. Apparently, even rampaging heretics have the sense to loot the good stuff first. Still, I found a stash of dried nutriment wafers and a jar of pickled vegetables that had been overlooked in favor of flashier cuisine. I stuffed as many wafers as I could into my satchel, hands trembling with relief at this mundane bounty. Each wafer was tasteless and bland, precisely why they'd been ignored, I suppose, but they would keep me alive. As I turned to leave, my luck ran out. One of the feasters had waddled into the pantry, perhaps looking for more treats. It was a woman, or had been a woman, draped in the tattered remains of an evening gown now several sizes too small for her engorged body. Her skin was flushed pink, and a garland of what looked like candied flower petals crowned her matted hair. She fixed her bulging, bloodshot eyes on me and let out a wet, guttural laugh. "Well, well, a little mouse sneaking around the larder?" she cooed, though her tone was mockery, not kindness. Bits of some red fruit, at least I hope it was fruit, dribbled from her lips as she spoke. I backed away, hitting a shelf. My mind raced, seeking an escape route, but she blocked the doorway with her bulk. "Come, dear, have a bite," she slurred, snatching a jar from a shelf and popping it open. Inside were candied eyeballs. Emperor knows from what creature. She shoved one into her mouth and chewed with relish. "So sweet," she groaned. "You must try one." Her other hand shot out with surprising speed for one so bloated, grabbing my wrist. Her grip was sticky and overpoweringly strong. The jar of eyeballs was thrust toward my face, the sickly sugar syrup running over the rim. Panic gave me strength. With my free hand, I grabbed at the nearest item on the shelf, a bottle of aged Amasec, and swung it hard at her head. The glass shattered against her temple, showering us both in spirits and shards. She howled, more in anger than pain, perhaps too drunk on pleasure to feel it. Her grip loosened just enough that I wrenched myself free, leaving a sleeve of my uniform in her fist. I bolted, dodging around her as she swiped at me with sticky fingers. I darted back into the kitchen, nearly slipping on spilled oil. A kitchen thrall, his body grotesquely modified with extra arms for stirring multiple pots, gibbered in surprise as I knocked past him. Behind me, I heard the woman rallying others. "There's a fresh little morsel loose in here," she sang out. Instantly, a half-dozen of the feasters came alive with predatory interest. I dashed through the kitchen door back toward the ballroom, clutching my satchel of food like it was a bag of diamonds. A burly man with a face smeared in pie filling lunged at me, but he was sluggish. I slid under his grasp and kept running. Out through the broken window I fled, my heart hammering. A shriek sounded behind me. One of them had caught sight of me in the garden. I tore through the hedges, thorns ripping at my arms, ignoring the sting. Behind, I could hear the clatter of heavy footsteps and incoherent shouts as the gluttons gave drunken chase. Praise the god Emperor for my youth spent sprinting through hive streets. I was fast when I needed to be. The warped revelers, weighed down by full bellies and intoxication, could not keep up for long. After a few frantic minutes of dodging between topiary sculptures and vaulting a low fence, I lost them in the twilight gloom. I crouched under a ridge of manicured roses, some now blooming in unnaturally vivid colors that almost glowed in the dark, and caught my breath as their angry calls faded. My hands were shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline, but I had done it. I had stolen nourishment from under Slaanesh's nose. There was a savage satisfaction in that, a tiny victory. I wolfed down a nutriment wafer right then and there, not even caring that it tasted like chalk. Nothing had ever been more delicious to me than that bland scrap in that moment. Over the following weeks, I would repeat similar foraging missions whenever desperation drove me to it. Every time was a gamble. The houses of plenty had become houses of death. I saw things that haunt me. A man so engorged he could no longer move, being hand-fed slivers of cake by chittering daemonettes until he literally burst. A circle of nobles seated in a fountain of wine, drowning themselves in drink and laughing, even as their lungs filled. A once-renowned chef who had captured a minor demon and was stewing it alive to distill new mind-altering flavors, while half-mad tasters eagerly lined up, tongues already blistered from previous concoctions. Resources weren't truly scarce on this world. If anything, there was more to indulge in than ever, but everything was weaponized as a vector for excess. You couldn't simply eat or drink for sustenance. Every sip or bite was a temptation to oblivion. Many survivors who initially avoided the cult's slaughter fell victim to these lures. I heard about a group of hiding miners from the hills who ventured into a seemingly abandoned supermarket for supplies. They ended up gorging themselves on the drug-laced goods and were found days later, bloated and euphoric, chanting praise to Slaanesh with their last gasps. I learned to be extremely selective. If something smelled too good, looked too colorful, I avoided it. I stuck to the plainest, most boring foodstuffs I could scavenge. Those were often left untouched by the devotees who craved ever more exotic fare. A tin of standard-issue ration protein, a sack of unmarinated grox jerky. Those were treasures to me in those days. Water was harder. The estate reservoirs had been tainted. The aqueducts ran with wine or worse. Sometimes I collected condensation or drank from an old hand pump well in the servants' quarter. Even that tasted faintly of some spice, but at least it wasn't immediately toxic. One day I struck gold in the metaphorical sense. I stumbled upon an overturned administratum supply truck on a quiet back lane. It had been full of basic provisions, likely being delivered for some event before the world fell. The cultists hadn't bothered with it because it contained no drugs or luxuries, just powdered recaf, flour, vitamin supplements, and water canisters. Blessed plain water. I wept when I pried open a canister and found it clean and pure. It was like a gift from the Emperor himself. I dragged as much of that haul as I could to one of my hideouts, an attic above an abandoned stables, and that sustained me for quite a while. Meanwhile, around me, the orgy of consumption never ceased. Day and night, though telling day from night was tricky under the warp-tainted sky, the feasting, drinking, and senseless expenditure of resources went on. The nobles and newly elevated cult leaders acted like princes of an overturned beehive, grabbing whatever they desired, however they desired, with no thought of consequence or scarcity. In a way, the concept of wealth had been annihilated. When there is no tomorrow, no trade, no external authority, what meaning do gold and jewels have? I saw a once powerful merchant lord who had spent decades amassing a collection of rare, off-world gemstones, now sitting in a pile of his own jewels, naked and laughing as he swallowed them one by one. He babbled that maybe they'd let him shine on the inside. Whether he died from that, I don't know. I didn't stick around to see the result. And yet, in this utter perversion of economy, a new currency existed: sensation. The only coin that mattered now was experience. The more novel, intense, or extreme, the higher one's status in the twisted social order that emerged. Those who could procure the most outrageously stimulating foods or the most exquisite wines were like barons among the damned. Chefs became cult priests of a sort, revered if they could craft ever more decadent flavors. I heard whispers of a banquet where the main course was a creature that could telepathically project the taste of its own emotions as it was cooked alive, a synesthetic delicacy that drove the diners into fits of ecstatic insanity. While I skulked in the shadows chewing on dry biscuits, the world dined on madness. I had to keep reminding myself that indulging, even a little, could be the end of me. One slip, one taste of that drugged wine, one bite of warp-touched fruit, and I could end up just like them, lost in rapture and servitude. Hunger, at least, anchored me to reality. Pain from thirst kept me focused. I began to embrace those discomforts as a strange sort of blessing, a tether to sanity. It's horrifying how, in the span of weeks, I had to reverse my entire attitude, from enjoying comfort and avoiding pain, to deliberately shunning comfort because it might lead to damnation. There were moments, of course, when the temptation was nearly overpowering. The Prince of Pleasure does not ignore someone lingering on the sidelines of his grand party. On a few occasions, when I lay in the dark on the edge of sleep, half-starved and half-dreaming, I swore I smelled freshly baked saffron bread, my favorite from childhood, or heard the faint fizz of a sweet cola drink I used to love. I'd shake myself awake and realize it was the warp working at the edges of my mind, offering me bait. It took all my will to not go running toward those phantom comforts. In the new world order of Slaanesh's playground, I saw what unrestrained greed truly looked like. It wasn't people hoarding wealth. It was people destroying wealth in their desperation to feel something. There is no waste too great, no extravagance too absurd. Entire storehouses of food were consumed in single feasts, wine vaults drained in marathon parties, treasures that could feed a hive city for years squandered in hours to impress fellow degenerates or to earn a fleeting smile from a watching demon. Every day was a festival of gluttony and extravagance, and every night left behind a wasteland of shattered finery and corpses of those who quite literally indulged themselves to death. I survived those early weeks by picking at the margins of these excesses, like a rat feeding after the feast, taking what little remained uncontaminated. It was humbling, infuriating, and terrifying all at once. But I lived. I kept my soul intact and my stomach barely filled, while all around me others were losing themselves one mouthful at a time. And as I skulked through golden halls now stained with vomit and blood, clutching a jug of water like it was the Emperor's holy grail, I began to truly understand the horror of Slaanesh. This chaos god didn't just want our lives or our obedience. It wanted to pervert every joy into a weapon against us. It wanted us to eat and drink ourselves into oblivion, to find out too late that our bliss was our bondage. I promised myself I would not be another fattened calf at Slaanesh's banquet. I would hold on to my hunger and my will. In this garden of excess, I would live like a weed in the corner, bitter and unwelcome, surviving when all the cultivated flowers had wilted from overwatering. Little did I know, hunger and thirst were the simplest trials. There were far more insidious forms of desire waiting to test me as I crept among the damned and tried to maintain my humanity. I had sated my belly just enough to keep going, but soon I would witness how Slaanesh feasted on far more than our bodies. The Lord of Excess also craved the pleasures of fleshly lust, of adoration and art, of pain and perfection. And it would not be long before I was dragged, unwilling, into those other arenas of depravity that this world now offered in plenty. If gluttony was the daily bread of this new world, lust was its overflowing wine. Everywhere I turned, the boundaries of decency and intimacy had been torn down and trampled. Pleasure, or rather a deranged mockery of it, became a public spectacle, an instrument of power, and a weapon as lethal as any blade. In the old Calypso, there were discreet houses of companionship, high-end courtesans for visiting nobles, tasteful dances at balls. Desire existed, but behind closed doors or within polite limits. Now, nothing was behind closed doors. The entire planet had become one continuous, writhing display of carnal excess at all hours. Privacy and modesty were archaic concepts, long since sacrificed on Slaanesh's altar. I learned to avoid certain districts of the city entirely. Whole neighborhoods had transformed into red-light labyrinths, glowing with lurid neon hues and the flicker of witchfire. The Grand Opera House, once home to refined musical performances, was now a palace of perversion. Its marquees dripped with pink and purple light, and obscene music, if it could be called music, thundered from within at all hours, a mix of throbbing drums and moaning notes that could be heard streets away. Once, driven by equal parts morbid curiosity and the need to find a rumored safe hiding place, I ventured near that opera house at dusk. I kept to the shadows of a colonnade across the street and peered at the entrance. The statues of the muses that lined the facade had been defaced and resculpted into leering, hermaphroditic figures beckoning visitors inside. A steady stream of corrupted revelers came and went through the grand doors, some dragging dazed captives behind them on leashes. From within spilled a symphony of sensation, laughter, screams of pain and pleasure indistinguishable from one another. The crack of whips, the clink of chains, and undertones of that unearthly music. My heart pounded with fear and a strange pull. I'd be lying if I said some part of me wasn't morbidly drawn by the atmosphere. Not because I wanted to join, but there was a nearly hypnotic allure to it, like a moth towards a flame that promises both light and destruction. While I watched, the doors flung open and a pair of figures emerged onto the steps, illuminated by the pink glow of braziers. One was a man, or at least had the shape of a man, clad in a leather harness studded with spikes, his skin glistening as if oiled. The other, Emperor Help Me, was a demonette, similar to those I'd seen the night of the fall. Her lithe form was barely covered by slivers of silk. In the torchlight, I could see her clearly, flawless humanoid beauty from the waist up, save for the crown of horns curling from her head and the feral grin of needle teeth. And from the waist down, she had sinuous, almost serpentine legs ending in clawed feet. One delicate hand caressed the man's cheek as they laughed together, while her other arm ended not in a hand at all, but in a grotesque, oversized claw that dripped with fresh blood. They were lovers, I realized with a mix of revulsion and horrified fascination. The man's chest bore a dozen bleeding scratches, and he leaned into the daemonette as if in a swoon of ecstasy, clearly savoring the pain she'd inflicted. She whispered something to him, sweet nothings or dark commands. Who could tell? He nodded fervently. Then, with an almost tender playfulness, she raked her claw gently down his bare back. He arched and shuddered, a guttural moan escaping his lips. To my utter disbelief, he then sank to his knees and kissed her claw, licking his own blood from it. I had seen enough, more than enough. I backed away, bile rising in my throat, and hurried off into the night before my presence could be detected. My hands would not stop trembling for an hour after. The image of that man's blissful face as he debased himself on that creature will haunt me forever. It was as if nothing of the Emperor's dignity remained in him. He lived only for the next exquisite stab of agony-tinged pleasure. Such scenes were commonplace now. Once I knew what to look for, I saw evidence of Slaanesh's carnal dominion everywhere. The parks and plazas where families once picnicked or lovers strolled were now littered with tangled bodies at all times of day. Strangers coupling, tripling, or worse in full view, urged on by roaming cadres of cult overseers. These overseers were often more far gone than their charges. I saw men and women with surgically or warp-altered bodies, their gender traits exaggerated or combined in unnatural ways, bedecked in garish makeup and wearing cloaks sewn from strips of human skin. They carried barbed whips, not so much to punish unwillingness — there was rarely any unwillingness left after the mind-breaking drugs they plied — but rather to heighten the stimulation. A lash here, a cut there, to keep the ecstasy red-lined. I had to be extremely careful moving through these zones. One wrong step or sound, and I might draw attention, and any unattached, unmutilated person like me was a prime prize. Fresh meat in the foul parlance of the streets. Despite my caution, there were close calls. One afternoon, skirting the edge of a once posh shopping boulevard, I was spotted by a pair of Slaaneshi cultists who appeared to be on patrol, if one can call prowling for victims patrol. They were a matched set, these two. A man and a woman, both scantily clad in studded leather straps crisscrossing their scarred flesh, their eyes ringed with heavy kohl and dilated from whatever they'd been sniffing or injecting. They moved with a predatory grace, and I could hear the woman humming some warped tune under her breath. I ducked behind an overturned hab-tram, but it was too late. The man had seen my motion. "Well now, what have we here?" he purred. I peeked through a broken window of the tram and locked eyes with him. His irises were a shocking pink color, and his smile was hungry. "Little bird, why are you hiding? Come sing for us." My blood ran cold. I did a quick mental tally. I was armed only with a small knife. I had indeed kept Marielle's knife. I'd cleaned it and kept it strapped to my thigh. These two cultists likely had other weapons, and certainly they had strength in numbers. Running might be my best bet, but the street was littered with debris and there was no guarantee I could outpace them. As I hesitated, the woman circled around the opposite side of the tram. They were trying to corner me. I could smell her perfume wafting through the air, sickly sweet with an undertone of rot. "Come out, dear," she cooed. "We won't hurt you. Much. In fact, you might just enjoy what we have planned." A giggle. My heart hammered. I silently prayed to the Emperor for deliverance, even as I steeled myself for a fight I was unlikely to win. The man tapped a rhythm on the metal hull of the tram with what looked like a thin dagger or stiletto. "No need to fear, girl. Pleasure's always better when shared. We'll show you sights you've never seen, make you feel like you've never felt." His voice was low, hypnotic in its cadence, almost soothing if not for the malice in his eyes. I crawled toward the back end of the tram, trying to keep the bulk of it between me and the woman. If I could break into a sprint down the adjoining alley. Suddenly, a crash. The woman had lost patience and kicked aside a piece of loose paneling, revealing herself just a few meters from me. She was grinning wolfishly, a hooked blade in one hand. I caught a glimpse of her fully now, emaciated yet sinewy, chest bare and ritually scarred with swirling patterns, her lower lip and even her nipples adorned with silver rings that jingled as she moved. She was the picture of depravity. "Got you now!" she hissed in delight. She pounced, remarkably fast. I scrambled back, narrowly avoiding a slashing cut that surely would have opened my throat had it landed. Her momentum carried her partially into the tram, practically on top of me. Desperate, I lashed out with my knife, catching her across the forearm. A line of bright blood appeared. Instead of crying out in pain, she laughed. A breathy, excited laugh. "Feisty," she exclaimed, eyes shining. "I like it." She swung again, and I blocked with my own blade. The impact jarred my arm. Meanwhile, the man had rounded the front of the tram. I was being flanked. He had drawn what looked like a whip made of fine metallic strands. With a flick of his wrist, it cracked toward me. I threw myself flat. The whip's tip snapped overhead, slicing through the air with a sound like a lethal whisper. Trapped between them, I did the only thing I could. Attacked forward toward the woman, trying to break past her and run. I lunged, stabbing towards her midsection. The move caught her off guard. My blade sank into her abdomen up to the hilt. Her grin froze, then turned into something like bliss. She grabbed my wrist, not to pull the knife out, but to pull me closer, sliding the blade even deeper into herself in the process. She shuddered, eyes half-lidded, and, "Emperor, save me," she moaned in pleasure. Warm blood spilled over my hand, and she barely seemed to notice, licking her lips. My stomach churned at the sight. I jerked back, finally wrenching the knife free from her gut. She collapsed to her knees, not dead, but momentarily too euphoric from the pain to continue fighting. But the man was on me in an instant. His whip coiled around my left arm, the thin wires biting sharply into my skin. I gasped as it cut flesh. He yanked, dragging me toward him. In his other hand, he still held that slender dagger. I knew if he got me within arm's reach, it was over. In sheer terror-fueled reflex, I swung my knife at the taut whip line binding my arm. Luck was with me. The blade was sharp and the whipcord thin. It snapped. Off balance from his own pull, the man stumbled back a step. I didn't hesitate. Summoning a scream of fury, I rushed him. He tried to bring his dagger up to stab me, but I was already upon him and desperate strength lent me speed. I drove my shoulder into his chest, knocking him against the tram's hull. My knife, slick with the woman's blood, plunged into his side beneath his ribcage. I think I struck a kidney or some vital organ, because his eyes went wide. His dagger scraped my ribs as his arm spasmed, a shallow cut, luckily not a fatal thrust. We struggled face to face for a brief moment. His breath reeked of narcotics. He snarled curses at me, even as blood bubbled on his lips. I twisted the knife and he gave a gurgling cry. With a surge of revulsion and adrenaline, I shoved away from him and he slid down the metal wall, leaving a smeared trail of blood. I stood there, panting, trembling from head to toe, scarcely believing I was still alive. The man writhed on the ground, clutching at his wound, trying to speak but only coughing up crimson. The woman was a short distance away, slumped against a pile of debris. She wasn't dead either. In fact, to my astonishment, she was softly laughing even as she pressed a hand to the gaping stab wound in her stomach, laughing and giving me a sultry, approving look. "That felt divine," she crooned at me, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were glassy with rapture. "Come here, pretty thing. We're not done." A cold realization hit me. These lunatics would not stop until either I was taken or they were truly incapable of moving. There was no outrunning wounded zealots who felt pain as pleasure. They'd crawl after me if they had to. The man was still fumbling for his dagger on the ground, stubbornly trying to stand despite the mortal wound. The woman began dragging herself toward me, leaving a smear of blood, her hand outstretched as if to caress me. I felt a scream rising in my throat. Of horror, of rage, I'm not sure. Instead, I channeled it differently. I stepped forward and, with a horrible grim determination, I stomped down on the man's neck with all my might. There was a crack, and he went still. The woman howled, whether in anguish or orgasmic delight, or both, I couldn't tell. Perhaps both. I turned to her, hands shaking, and raised my knife. Her lips curled in a defiant grin, baring teeth pink with her own blood. "Yes, do it," she hissed, leaning her head back and presenting her throat in offering. "Emperor's little bitch, do it." I wanted nothing more in that moment than to be away from this nightmare. I wanted her to shut up, to stop looking at me like that, to stop existing. With tears in my eyes and a prayer of forgiveness on my lips, I granted her wish. One swift slash and her laughter finally ceased, gurgling into silence. I staggered back, wiping the blood from my face, nearly hyperventilating. 2 cultists lay dead at my feet. I had killed before, I suppose. On the night of the masquerade, I'd brained Lady Celestine, though she might have lived, and I'd seen Marielle die by her own hand. But this was the first time I had intentionally, brutally taken lives with my own hands. There was no time to feel guilt or horror at myself, though. I had to move. The commotion could attract others. Sure enough, distant shouts and footsteps echoed from down the boulevard. Possibly friends of these two, or simply others drawn by the scent of blood and the prospect of a fresh kill. Clutching my wounded arm, the whip had carved a lattice of cuts, bleeding but thankfully not too deep. I fled into the nearest alley and didn't stop running for what felt like hours. When I finally collapsed in a half-ruined alcove that night, I was overcome not just with exhaustion, but with grief and anger. Not at the fact I'd had to kill, though the revulsion of it gnawed at me, but at what this world had become to force such savagery from me. Slaanesh had turned our home into a hunting ground of lust, where people like those two cultists delighted in chasing down innocents to sate their twisted desires. They had once been human, I reminded myself. Perhaps they were minor nobles or shopkeepers before, ordinary people who should have enjoyed ordinary love, courtship, tenderness. Instead, they became predators reveling in cruelty as if it were lovemaking. This realization hurt almost as much as my physical wounds. I held myself and quietly sobbed in that dark alcove, mourning not only my lost innocence, but the loss of any genuine intimacy or love in this place. Lust had become something monstrous here. It wasn't about connection or affection. It was about domination, submission, suffering, and the obliteration of the self in sensation. Any notion of gentle lovemaking or the simple warmth of a lover's embrace had been twisted into extremes beyond recognition. I thought of all the small hopes I used to have for my own life. Perhaps I'd meet someone kind one day, maybe even at a ball or among the staff, someone to share quiet moments with. Those dreams seemed so distant and naive now. In this world, if I met someone, likely they'd try to violate or corrupt me, or I'd be forced to hurt them first. It was a bitter pill to swallow that even if by some miracle I survived, the scars of what I'd seen and done here might never let me know normal love or trust again. On the streets outside, the orgies of atrocity continued unabated. I heard ecstatic screams and the sounds of flesh on flesh, punctuated by cries to dark gods. Sometimes I heard people crying out to Slaanesh in the throes of their debasement, naming the Dark Prince as their lover, their master. It made my skin crawl. Yet through all this, I felt a stubborn flame flicker in my heart, a mix of disgust and defiance. I whispered to myself in the darkness, I am not like them. I will not become like them. It became a sort of mantra. Slaanesh could claim the others. I would cling to whatever shred of decency and sense I had left, even if it meant living like a wounded animal at the margins. The coming days only further proved how pervasive the corruption of flesh had become. There was no corner of the city, no matter how formerly sacred or innocent, that hadn't been touched. The orphanage near the riverfront, once run by kind ecclesiarchy sisters, had turned into a brothel where the sisters themselves, corrupted, served as hosts in unspeakable rites. The public bathhouse had become a drowning pit of narcotic-laced waters where dozens of bodies intertwined under the surface, chasing an ultimate high of asphyxiation and release. Even the cathedral, the grand cathedral of the Emperor's Light at the city center, was not spared. One morning I forced myself to see it with my own eyes. Perhaps I hoped for some sign of sanctity holding out. What I found was the great bronze aquila torn down and replaced with a giant sigil of Slaanesh, garlanded with chains of roses and entrails. Inside, the once hallowed nave had become a decadent court. Silk cushions and pillows piled where pews used to stand. A perfumed haze hung in the air, and upon the altar were strewn the bodies of what might have been 4 or 5 individuals, interlocked in a perpetual act of combined pleasure and pain, their bodies still moving weakly under the influence of some warp-born stimulant, even as I suspect they were close to death from exhaustion. Presiding over this blasphemy was a figure in the vestments of a high priest, except the vestments had been refashioned into something between a gown and a fetish outfit. I realized with horror that it was the cathedral's own cardinal, or had been. He was alive and clearly mad, leading a congregation of the damned in chanting praises to Slaanesh as a few surviving choir boys, their eyes empty, drugged perhaps, played a sultry tune on violins in the choir loft. I left that place sick to my core. If the Emperor's house had fallen, what hope was there? Still, through sheer will or stubbornness, I survived and resisted. Every cell in my body loathed what I saw, and that loathing kept me from ever slipping into temptation. If hunger was my tether before, now disgust served equally well. I wrapped myself in it like armor. The foulness of their pleasures was a constant reminder of what I never wanted to become. I like to think perhaps the Emperor was giving me strength in those times, shielding my mind just enough that I wouldn't break. Or maybe I simply hadn't yet been pushed past my limit. Regardless, each day I endured was another tiny victory of self over the all-consuming excess around me. I began to realize something else, too. Slaanesh's dominion, for all its fervor, was brittle. People were expending themselves at an alarming rate. Bodies turned up in the gutters, smiling in death from an overdose of bliss. Some participants simply collapsed after days of continuous debauchery, their hearts giving out from the strain of delight. The population was burning like candles lit at both ends. I wondered, if this went on, would the world eventually just snuff itself out? Would there be a quiet at the end, after everyone had literally destroyed themselves chasing that ultimate high? Or would new fiends just keep pouring in from the warp to replace the fallen? It was a morbid thought, but it gave me a sliver of grim hope. Maybe the frenzy would die down naturally if there were fewer people left to partake. Maybe, just maybe, some equilibrium would return once the initial orgy of takeover had expended its fury. I was wrong, of course. The lull would not come on its own. Slaanesh's appetite is never sated, and those that serve it only escalate their pursuits when simple excess no longer thrills them. There were other heights of debasement yet to scale, the arenas of pain and perfection, the twisted art and adulation that took hold next. But at that time, huddled in my hiding hole, recovering from battle and horror, I clung to the faint idea that perhaps the worst had peaked. Perhaps there was nothing more they could do that I hadn't already seen. I was wrong. There were always deeper circles of excess on this pleasure world turned hell, and I would soon witness how the search for new experiences would push the inhabitants to entertain themselves not just with feasts and fornication, but with cruelty, competition, and vanity of the most depraved sort. My trial by lust had been survived. Barely. Now, new trials awaited in the arenas of pain and the courts of twisted pride. It soon became clear that even the boundless debauchery of food and flesh was not enough to sate the new lords of Calypso. As days turned to weeks, a shift occurred. Those still living, and there were still many, though fewer each day, began seeking new heights of sensation beyond mere indulgence. The city, and indeed the entire planet, started to take on the atmosphere of a grotesque contest or exhibition, as if everyone was trying to outdo everyone else in impressing their insatiable patron, Slaanesh. This was the era of performance and pride, art, music, violence, and vanity, all amplified to insane extremes. Slaanesh is, after all, not just the Prince of Pleasure, but also of perfection, obsession, and the need to be adored. I kept mostly to the sidelines of this development, but even from the shadows one could witness the transformation. The same opera house that had become a den of carnal vice now also hosted nightly shows. Not the kind any sane person would want to see, but shows nonetheless, horrific pageants of artistry and agony combined. Banners were raised across ruins of civic buildings, announcing contests, a symphony of screams here, a festival of blades there, the coronation of excess to cap the week. It was as if the whole world had become a perverse festival ground, and the participants were vying for the Dark Prince's attention, like deranged performers in a galactic amphitheater. One twilight, I found myself drawn to the old Colosseum on the city's outskirts. In better times, it hosted sports and martial tournaments for entertainment. I had seen a rebroadcast of a fencing championship held there once, with cheering crowds and elegant swordplay. Now, from miles away, I could hear a roar of noise echoing from it. Not just the roar of a crowd, but something metallic and amplified, like a discordant electric guitar wailing mixed with human shrieks. Creeping closer through a series of abandoned gardens and alleys, I managed to find a vantage point in the upper terraces of the Colosseum. The structure had partially collapsed in places, perhaps during the initial chaos or purposeful remodeling by the cult, but large sections of seating and the arena floor were intact. Keeping low, I peered through a crack in the masonry down at the spectacle below. The arena was lit by great bonfires that gave off oddly colored flames, green, pink, blue, casting a kaleidoscope of shadows. A huge crowd packed the stands, though crowd implies something orderly. They writhed and swayed, many in the throes of stims or warp frenzy, applauding and screaming at the events unfolding on the central field. On the arena floor, several concurrent performances took place on makeshift stages and platforms. On one side, I saw a group of half-naked figures dancing and contorting their bodies in impossible ways on a stage draped in silk and spiked chains, a dance both beautiful and unsettling. Across from them, a cage had been erected, inside which a gladiatorial duel was ongoing between two combatants, each moving with incredible grace as they traded blows that sent sprays of blood onto the sand. Elsewhere, an enormous canvas had been laid out on the ground, and a team of artists were busy painting on it. Except their paint glistened darkly and their brushes looked like long bones. I realized with horror they were painting a mural using human blood and viscera, likely from a still writhing pile of materials beside the canvas. Presiding over all of this, elevated on a grandstand where once VIP guests might have sat, was a cluster of figures that I immediately recognized as the leaders of this nightmare. Among them, I spotted the governor, or the thing that had been the governor, reclined on a throne-like chair, attended by simpering slave fanning him with peacock feathers. He was barely recognizable now, his once regal attire replaced by flowing robes of purple and gold open at the chest, revealing grotesque surgical modifications to his body. I saw extra nipples, silver hooks in his flesh holding gems, and scar patterns like tattoos. His face was painted in garish makeup, and he looked utterly lost to ecstasy, clapping like a delighted child at the carnage below. Beside him, in stark contrast, stood a towering figure that made my blood run cold, an Astartes, a space marine, albeit a twisted one. His power armor was a riot of colors, glossy purple and pink with gold filigree, and covered in Baroque adornments. Chains, scarves of skin, screaming faces embossed on the pauldrons. He bore no helmet, revealing strikingly handsome if cruel features, pallid skin, and eyes that shone with an unsettling fervor. A long topknot of hair flowed down his back. I could see a distinctive symbol painted on his armor's shoulder, the three-armed star of Slaanesh, alongside an ancient numeral 3. Only later would I realize I had been looking at a champion of the Emperor's children, the traitor Marines devoted to Slaanesh since the Horus heresy. At that moment, I just knew he was something terrible and powerful, a being bred for war but given to dark indulgence. He surveyed the arena like a king inspecting his court. In one hand, he idly held an ornate sword, and from his backpack came protrusions that looked like organ pipes or speakers. I had heard whispers of the legendary Noise Marines, Astartes who weaponized sound itself to inflict pain and pleasure, and here one was in the flesh. Flanking these central figures were other notable fiends. I recognized the cardinal of the cathedral, now dressed absurdly in a jester's motley, juggling what looked like severed heads as he capered around. A slender figure with a porcelain mask stood calmly, I think it might have been one of the governor's favored courtiers, now acting as a sort of master of ceremonies. Various richly dressed cult nobles lounged, comparing their latest affectations and competing to draw the Marine's attention or the governor's favor. What struck me was how much this resembled an event, an organized affair, in contrast to the chaotic revelry I'd seen before. The difference now was purpose. These people, if they could still be called that, were intentionally pushing boundaries to entertain and impress, to one-up each other in depravity and skill. Excess had become a performance art. As I watched, the dance troupe concluded their routine with a flourish, the climax being one dancer lifting another who was impaled upon a pole, the living spear screaming in a mix of pain and pleasure as the dancer twirled them like a prop. The crowd went wild at this shocking finale, applauding thunderously. Bouquets of strange glowing flowers were thrown into the pit, from whence they got flowers in this hell I have no idea, perhaps conjured. The Marine, lips curled in a half-smile, gave a gracious clap from the grandstand. The governor giggled and tossed down a handful of coins, or teeth, I couldn't tell, as a reward. The dancers bowed, astonishingly, the impaled victims still alive enough to wave a feeble hand, and dragged their human pole off stage, leaving a slick of blood behind. Next, the attention turned to the gladiator duel. The two fighters, one a lithe woman armed with dual blades, the other a hulking brute with a chain flail, were circling each other for the amusement of the audience. But this was no ordinary death match. I quickly realized the fighters were intentionally prolonging the fight, making it as artistic as possible. The woman with dual blades moved like a ballerina, each step choreographed. The brute, though muscular, kept his movements measured and surprisingly graceful, spinning his flail in intricate patterns that sung through the air. When one would strike the other, they did so shallowly, drawing blood but not ending it, almost as if painting on each other's bodies with cuts. The crowd's cheers rose and fell with the rhythm of their combat, as though watching a finely tuned dance. At one point, the woman did a backflip to dodge an attack, landed in a split, and in that pose sliced the brute's thigh open. Rather than roar in pain, the brute laughed and bowed to her mid-battle, as if acknowledging a beautiful move in a sport. Blood poured down his leg, but he fought on. This went on until both were covered in dozens of wounds, moving slower from blood loss. The performance needed a finale. With a sudden burst of speed, the brute wrapped his chain flail around the woman, binding her arms. Instead of finishing her immediately, he lifted her off her feet in a crushing embrace. She responded by leaning in and kissing him deeply, even as the spiked chains constricted them both. It was a bizarre tableau, lover's embrace or mortal strike, perhaps both. She then wrenched one arm free, just enough to plunge a dagger, I don't know where she had hidden it, into the side of his neck. Blood spurted across both of them. The brute staggered, and the two collapsed together to the sand, entwined, each mortally wounded. The arena exploded in cheers at this tragic climax. Some spectators were crying tears of joy at the artistry of it. I saw the Marine rise to his feet, raising his arms as if acknowledging the fighter's skill. A horrific sound blared from the devices on his armor, a discordant yet somehow melodious blast of noise that swept over the stadium. The crowd quivered as the sound hit them. Many fell into fits of ecstatic convulsions. I clapped my hands over my ears instinctively, though at my distance it was not as overwhelming. I realized it was applause. The Noise Marine was literally providing a standing ovation via a cacophonous sonic blast. Down in the arena, unbelievably, the female duelist was still barely alive, crawling from beneath the corpse of her opponent. She looked upward, blood streaming from her mouth, and with a trembling flourish, bowed in the direction of the grandstand. The Marine inclined his head in respect, as did the governor and other nobles. Immediately, a swarm of attendants, some human cult medics, some giggling demonettes, rushed onto the field. Rather than giving her true medical aid, I suspect they came to pamper her, to load praise upon her even as she lay dying. One demonette lifted the duelist's head onto her lap, almost tenderly. In the stands, chants began, "Vivelin, Vivelin." Perhaps that was the duelist's name. The crowd was showing genuine adulation, like she was a beloved hero. In this twisted world, a woman who had just engaged in a lethal, erotic dance of death was now being idolized, worshipped in her final moments as a paragon of Slaaneshi virtue. Grace, pain, and perfection, all in one. I shook my head in disbelief. It occurred to me that the concept of a hero had not vanished from this fallen society. It had simply been inverted. They still had their celebrities and champions, but now those were the individuals who could achieve the most extraordinary acts of excess and skill combined. The crowd's need to adore someone, to elevate a person to near divine status, hadn't disappeared. Slaanesh had merely given them new idols. Not all the acts in the arena were voluntary displays of prowess. I witnessed darker scenes too. At one end, a group of prisoners, likely surviving prudes or unlucky souls like me who had been captured, were lined up. One by one, they were brought before a platform where an artist in a blood-spattered smock stood ready with a variety of implements. In front of a live audience, he began to sculpt them. And by sculpt, I mean he used knives, acid, and emperor knows what to physically reshape these screaming people into grotesque living statues. It was atrocity as performance art. The audience watched in rapt attention as this sculptor cut and bent limbs, applied sizzling chemicals to warp flesh. The victim's screams were just part of the composition. When a prisoner died on the table, and most did before the art was finished, the sculptor would dramatically fling his arms and declare it a failure to the jeers or laughter of the crowd. On one, though, he succeeded in keeping the poor soul alive, in a state of flayed, contorted agony that vaguely resembled a figure in a state of ecstasy. The crowd gave a standing ovation for that one. I forced myself not to retch as the sculptor proudly presented the still-twitching artwork to the Marine and governor. The Marine clapped politely, no noise blast this time, and the governor tossed the sculptor a trinket as a reward. I squinted and realized it was one of the Emperor's holy symbols, defiled and reshaped into Slaanesh's mark. A twisted badge of honor. For all the horror, one detail struck me above all: the hunger in the eyes of the spectators. A different kind of hunger than the gluttony or lust I'd seen. This was a hunger to feel impressed, to be astonished, to find something novel. They cheered not just out of cruelty, but out of a genuine, perverted appreciation for the skill and beauty on display, as if these were truly great works and deeds to celebrate. In their corrupted minds, they likely were. It dawned on me how complete the corruption was. Slaanesh had taken every fundamental drive, hunger, lust, pride, curiosity, and twisted them. These people needed new stimuli like a drug, yes, but they also needed idols, needed to adore and emulate those idols. Perhaps at some subconscious level they were still human enough to crave meaning or admiration. And since all traditional virtues were gone, they created new ones out of vice. I witnessed acts of singular vanity too. Nobles who arranged public ceremonies to display their newly grafted wings or extra limbs, turning themselves into living peacocks for compliments. Duelists who fought not for survival or dispute, but to prove they'd mastered some new extravagant fighting style that none could match. Musicians who no longer cared if anyone listened so long as they could say they composed the most bizarre and shocking piece in existence. One such composer had an ensemble playing a piece where each note corresponded to a shriek from a tortured victim, a ghastly concerto of pain. Among themselves, these devotees began to form factions or cults centered on particular obsessions. There was the cult of the perfect chord, who believed enlightenment lay in creating the ultimate sound. They carried strange instruments fused to their bodies and often dueled in sonic battles. Another was the Fellowship of the Severed Touch, who engaged in a sort of competitive bloodletting, wearing their scars like medals and claiming each cut brought them closer to sublime sensation. They'd gather and literally compare wounds like art critics examining paintings. I even saw one day a procession through the avenue, a group of cultists bearing an ornate palanquin on their shoulders. Upon it reclined a figure who at first I mistook for a golden statue of a woman. So still and radiant she was. Then I realized she was alive, her skin painted gold, her form thin and ethereally perfect like some classical sculpture. The bearers were chanting her praises, calling her the living Venus. Crowds bowed as she passed, some reaching out to touch the hem of her sheet-like white gown as if she were a saint. She had apparently starved and purified herself of all ugliness and excess flesh, becoming an icon of deadly beauty. I suspect in a few more days she would literally die from that pursuit of aesthetic perfection. But in those moments she was adored as an ideal. It was all as heartbreaking as it was horrifying. These once people chasing meaning in madness, seeking esteem by diving ever deeper into depravity. From my secret vantage points, I watched these exhibitions when I could do so safely. Part of me wondered if some kernel of true art or bravery lingered in these displays, a remnant of what humanity once admired, now distorted. For instance, the duelist Vivalin, if that was her name. Her fight was horrific, yes, but it was also tragically courageous and skillful. In another life, in a just cause, could she have been a great warrior for the Imperium, a champion we might have cheered in honest sport or battle? The thought made me mourn all over again for what we'd lost. In those days, I began to hate Slaanesh not only for the pain and excess, but for the mockery. This chaos god wasn't content to kill or enslave us. It had to steal every noble spark in us and turn it into a guttering parody. Our love became lust, our talent became obsession, our heroism became vanity. Nothing true or pure was allowed to survive untwisted. My own survival started to hinge on one more quality: humility, or at least anonymity. I had to remain utterly inconspicuous, a total nobody. In this world, to draw attention was death or corruption. And ironically, as the rest of the populace clamored for more attention and sensory input, I cultivated the opposite: silence, smallness, invisibility. I crept like a ghost in the rafters and tunnels, observing but never participating. It was lonely and terrifying, but it kept me from becoming part of the circus. I think the only thing that prevented my discovery during those arena events was that everyone was too enthralled by the main acts to notice a solitary pair of eyes glinting in a high corner. Plus, chaos reigned even in these organized shows. A stray loner in the shadows wasn't high on anyone's list when blood and fireworks commanded their gaze. I continued to scavenge when needed and hide when possible. After that particularly grand festival at the Colosseum, I kept well away from major gatherings for a while, fearing that with each spectacle the fervor grew, and maybe eventually even the stands would be swept up into violence. I did hear rumors, whispered by a ragged servant I once found cowering in a wine cellar before he ran off in mad laughter, that a climactic celebration was brewing. Something about The prince's eyes will turn to us on the 6th week of Jubilee, and the veil will part for our final ascension. This kind of prophetic cult babble was common, but it made my skin crawl more than usual. It implied they aimed to summon or manifest something big, perhaps even Slaanesh itself in some way. The thought that things could escalate further was almost beyond me. What was left to do that hadn't been done? However, maybe I'd already glimpsed the answer. It wasn't about doing something new to themselves anymore. It was about bringing Slaanesh's presence fully here to revel with them. They wanted their dark god's direct attention, and that was a nightmare far beyond personal survival. At that point, a hard kernel of purpose formed in me. I would not give Slaanesh the satisfaction of my submission or participation. I would rather die quietly in a ditch than join their sick games. If there was even a sliver of hope to thwart any of it, I'd cling to it. But what could I do, alone, unarmed? The knife hardly counted now, especially with Astartes and demons around, half-starved woman in a world gone mad. The scale of the heresy and debauchery was planetary. There was no uprising of loyalists coming. Any who remained loyal were dead or in hiding like me, and few. The Imperium, I was sure, had either forgotten us or chosen to quarantine and eventually destroy us. That thought, that perhaps an inquisitor somewhere had already signed our death warrant, oddly gave me comfort at times. Better a swift end by orbital fire than endless existence in this hell. Still, my story wasn't over yet. I had survived gluttony, resisted lust, and kept my head down amidst the prideful competitions of the damned. Slaanesh had tested my body and my ideals, but there remained one more temptation at the edge of it all. The temptation to give up, to lay down and know peace, the promise of oblivion and rest. And it was a temptation that, in time, I nearly succumbed to. Before the final act of this nightmare, I would face one last trial of the spirit, one that came not in the form of terror or pain, but in the guise of gentle, beguiling mercy. After so much horror and adrenaline, I didn't realize how bone-weary I had become. Days or weeks, who could tell, of constant fear and vigilance had ground me down physically and mentally. I was operating on sheer will and hatred by that point. And that is a finite fuel. One gray morning, I found myself wandering beyond the outskirts of the city. Perhaps some subconscious part of me sought escape, or at least a brief respite from the constant screaming insanity. The city's edge melted into rolling hills and estate vineyards. Much of it had been ravaged, vines torn up, gazebos burned, pleasure pavilions toppled or transformed into garish shrines. But farther out, I came upon a curious zone of calm. It was a small valley where an ornamental lake lay smooth as glass, surrounded by willow trees and flowering bushes. This had been a retreat for nobles, a place of tranquility by design. And strangely, it remained beautiful, almost untouched by the chaos. The grass was green and dotted with little white blossoms. The air was quiet, save for gentle birdsong. Birds, actual living birds, chirped in the willows as if nothing were amiss. The sky above was overcast but light, no longer the swirling psychedelic nightmare of the city skies. For a moment I wondered if I had somehow wandered right out of the warp storm, through some unseen threshold, back into real life. Cautiously I stepped forward. The soft grass under my feet felt normal. Not squelching with blood, not shifting with hidden mutations, just grass. A breeze rustled the willows, carrying the scent of jasmine and fresh water. I drank it in, my heart aching with longing. It smelled like the old Calypso, the paradise world at peace. Tears stung my eyes unexpectedly. I realized I hadn't felt a gentle breeze or heard a simple bird call in what seemed an eternity. My shoulders sagged, the weight of all I'd seen pressed down at once. In that tranquil moment, I felt the fight in me falter. I just wanted to rest. Emperor knows, I wanted to close my eyes and pretend everything was all right again. Across the lake, I spotted a small gazebo with white columns, half hidden by flowering hedges. It looked intact. There was even a little rowboat moored by a dock nearby. A memory fluttered through my mind, a scene of a couple in genteel courtship paddling that boat under a summer sun. Something out of a holovid drama. Something normal, innocent, good. Almost in a trance, I walked toward the gazebo. Each step I took into that valley, the tension in my muscles eased. The silence wasn't eerie, like elsewhere. It was soothing. The birds continued to chirp softly. I actually saw one, a yellow finch, flit down and perch on a broken marble statue by the path. It regarded me with beady black eyes, head cocked. Then it sang a little trill and flew off. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, and a small, fragile smile formed on my lips. The first smile in ages. I approached the gazebo's entrance. Inside, it was arranged with a few cushioned benches and a low table, as if awaiting afternoon tea. Unbelievably, a porcelain teapot and cups sat on that table. I had to blink to be sure I wasn't imagining it. They were real, decorated with blue floral patterns. There was even a plate with what looked like biscuits. At this point, alarm bells should have rung in my mind. It was too perfect, too inviting. But I was so weary, so emotionally raw, that I pushed caution aside. Or rather, caution quietly went to sleep in some corner of my mind, lulled by the utter normalcy of the scene. I stepped into the gazebo. A gentle chiming sounded, wind bells hanging from the eaves, stirred by the breeze. On one of the benches lay a folded blanket, in case of chill, perhaps. I ran a hand over it. It was soft, finely woven wool. The simple sensation of softness was overwhelming. I realized I'd been sleeping on hard floors or rough straw for weeks. My eyes burned with tears again. "Hello?" I ventured softly. No answer. No sign of anyone. Perhaps a noble servant had set this up before the fall and fled, or died, leaving it untouched. My stomach fluttered as I eyed the teapot. Could it be? I touched it, still warm. There was tea inside. I could smell the gentle aroma of chamomile. Someone must have been here recently, but who would brew chamomile in hell? A part of me whispered that it didn't matter. Here it was. A reprieve. A mercy. Maybe a sign from the Emperor that he hadn't forsaken me entirely. Maybe a pocket of reality persisted here. With trembling hands, I poured a cup. The golden liquid steamed. I picked up a biscuit. It was buttery and real. Poison? Possibly. But at that moment, I didn't care. If this was poison, it was a kinder death than anything else on this planet. I sat on the bench, wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, and sipped the tea. It was heavenly. Not just the taste, but the warmth spreading through me. My eyes slipped shut, and I breathed out long and slow. For the first time in recent memory, I felt safe. My guard lowered fully. The tea's warmth soaked into my bones, loosening every knotted muscle. I ate a biscuit, sweet with a hint of lemon. A favorite kind from my childhood, actually. How fortunate, I thought dimly. Fortunate, I murmured to myself. That word normally would be laughable here, but yes, I felt fortunate to have stumbled into this little sanctuary. I lay down on the bench, tucking the blanket around me. My eyelids were so heavy. Perhaps I should properly check that it was safe to sleep. Just a quick rest, though, couldn't hurt. Just a short nap. I can't remember the last time I truly slept without jolting awake from nightmares or danger. Just a little while. The sounds of the gentle wind chimes and lapping lake water filled my ears. The jasmine scent was like a lullaby. I drifted. I found myself dreaming of my home as a child back on my birth world, a place of no importance, an agri-settlement. I dreamed of running through wheat fields at dusk, chasing my younger brother while our mother called us in for supper. Emperor, I hadn't thought of those days in so long. The dream was vivid and happy. I saw my brother's laughing face. I heard my mother's voice, warm and loving. Then my father was there too, and we were all sitting down to eat around a rustic wooden table outside our farmhouse, under strings of lantern lights. It was so peaceful, so full of love. I wanted to stay there forever, in that golden moment that never was. We never had such perfect dinners in reality. Life was always hardscrabble on the farm. Father died young, etc., but here in the dream it was perfect. A figure approached our table. A neighbor, perhaps? A tall, kindly stranger whose face I never quite saw. My family welcomed him, offered him a seat. He said, "You've done well, child. Rest now. There is nothing but peace for you here." I smiled. Yes, peace, at long last. The stranger reached out and gently took my hand across the table. His touch was cool and soothing, like placing my hand in refreshing water. "Stay," he whispered. I felt myself nodding in the dream, tears of joy in my eyes. But as he held my hand, I noticed something odd. A single drop of liquid fell onto the table from somewhere. It was red, like blood, staining the white tablecloth. I glanced up. A dark stain was spreading across the stranger's face, dripping from what looked like a wound on his forehead. I pulled my hand back, alarm rising. Another drop of blood fell, and another. The scene around me subtly dimmed. I looked to my mother. Blood was seeping from her closed eyes as she smiled. My father and brother, too, red tears silently streaking down their faces, their smiles unfaltering, as if they didn't notice. Heart hammering, I pushed back from the table. The kindly stranger's head tilted in curiosity, blood now pouring down his face. Yet he spoke softly still. "Why the fear? Isn't this what you wanted?" The lanterns above flickered and then extinguished one by one, plunging the scene into twilight gloom. In the silence, the gentle chirp of birds was gone. Instead, I heard something else, a wet, cloying sound, like a tongue dragging across lips, amplified and all around. My family stood from the table in unison, their movements eerily synchronized and puppet-like. Their eyes opened, but there were no eyes, just gaping holes of darkness leaking scarlet. They spoke as one in the stranger's voice, a chorus that was at once tender and chilling. "Stay, rest, feel no pain, ever again." Their heads tilted in unison, a grotesque parody of concern. I screamed in the dream, a wordless sound of denial. The farmhouse and fields dissolved, curling away like burning paper. The darkness behind my family ripped open into a gaping maw lined with countless tiny cooing mouths. From it, a slimy, many-fingered hand reached out toward me. With a lurch and a gasp, I awoke, truly awoke, back in the gazebo. It was late afternoon. I had slept longer than intended. The teacup lay spilled on the floor, the tea soaking into the wood. My blanket had partially slipped off, and to my horror I saw that creeping up one corner of the blanket was a spreading stain of pinkish slime, like a moss or mold of chaos, tendrils of it inching toward my arm. I bolted upright and flung the blanket away. It landed on the table, and immediately the entire cloth and tea set underneath began to sizzle, as if corroding with acid. I stumbled out of the gazebo, heart pounding. The scene outside had changed subtly too. The flowers around the gazebo were wilted and oozing pus from their blossoms. The willow trees by the lake now hung limp and colorless, and their reflections in the lake were distorted. The water itself no longer looked so crystal clear. Beneath its surface, I thought I saw shapes moving slowly, coiling and uncoiling. I realized with dawning dread that the peaceful valley had been yet another trick, a far more subtle and merciful seeming one, but a trick nonetheless. A warp enchantment to lull and trap me, perhaps forever, in dreams of bliss. Maybe I would have simply slept until I died of dehydration, all the while dreaming sweet dreams. Or maybe something worse would have claimed my soul as I dreamed, fed on my essence gently like a spider draining a fly. The dream. That stranger, that voice, likely a demon of Slaanesh whispering promises of eternal rest. Feel no pain ever again. It sounded so kind, so tempting. And the vision of my family, how deftly it plucked that deep desire from my mind, the longing for home, for parental comfort, for a life before terror. I felt a surge of anger cut through my lingering grogginess. I screamed hoarsely at the tranquil lake. "You won't have me. I won't stay here and die in a dream." As if in response, a slow ripple coursed across the lake's surface, and a few bubbles of noxious gas belched up, releasing that jasmine scent, now overly sweet, cloying to the point of revulsion. The finch I'd seen earlier lay dead by the water's edge, ants already crawling over its little corpse. I backed away, stumbling up the slope whence I came. The illusion was collapsing now that I'd rejected it. The valley's colors dulled to a sickly hue. I could feel a presence, unseen but palpable, withdrawing in disappointment. I had denied it a prize, and it was not pleased. The willows seemed to writhe, though there was no breeze, as if some invisible frustration moved through them. As I regained the hill crest, I heard a sigh, a disembodied, androgynous sigh that echoed faintly. Poor child, so much suffering could have been spared. Ah well. It almost sounded genuinely sad, as if pitying me for refusing its false paradise. The sheer perversity of that sentiment made me clench my fists. Back on the outskirts of the city, the distant sounds of madness persisted on the horizon, but within me, a new fire had been lit. That false sanctuary had nearly broken me by offering what I yearned for most, peace. But peace under the terms of chaos is a lie. It was just another form of consumption, an easy end, a silken noose. I realized that despite everything, I did not truly want to die in sleep, comfortable or not. Some stubborn part of me still wanted to live, or at least to see this nightmare through to whatever end fate had in store. If the Emperor willed me to suffer a while longer in reality, so be it. Better than surrendering my soul to that smiling void. Exhausted but resolute, I moved on. The final act was drawing near. I could feel it like a change in the air. The cultists' frenzies were reaching a fever pitch, the very ground quivering with pent-up chaotic energy. And through it all I walked, a tiny scarred figure with nothing left to lose but my final breath. I had resisted every lure, indulgence of the flesh, intoxication of the senses, glory of the crowd, and the release of oblivion. There was only one thing left that Slaanesh and this doomed world could take from me. My life. And I suspected, one way or another, that reckoning was coming soon. The sky above was growing unnaturally dark as the appointed time of their great celebration neared. In that gloom, I steeled myself for whatever would come. I hoped, truly, fervently hoped, that it would be an ending. One way or another, I felt the end approaching. I just prayed that when that end came, I would meet it as myself, as the woman who refused to bow to the Prince of Pleasure, and not as one of the mind-shattered puppets dancing in his courtyards. If I could do that, perhaps my soul might still find some redemption, or at least rest in the Emperor's sight. With that thought as a final anchor, I headed toward the heart of the city, toward whatever finale the servants of Slaanesh were preparing, toward the last nightmare. When the end came, it was heralded by a night without dawn. The appointed time of the cult's grand celebration arrived under a sky churning with unnatural darkness, shot through by occasional streaks of lurid color. The air was thick with anticipation, a cloying psychic pressure that set my teeth on edge. I kept to the ruins at the edge of Victory Plaza, a bitter name now. This was the great square before the governor's palace, a space that could hold tens of thousands. And it did. From my concealed perch in the shattered upper floor of a guild house, I saw the multitudes gathered below in a sea of flickering torchlight and warp glow. Every faction of the damned was present: painted nobles, mutated priests, writhing cult masses, and warbands of noise marines and their mortal sycophants. They had erected a massive statue in the center of the plaza, a grotesque amalgam of gold and flesh that roughly depicted Slaanesh's sacred form, twin-gendered, lithe, arms outstretched in welcome. It towered above the crowd, draped in silk and dripping with scented oils. Drums pounded a slow, steady beat. The assembled throng chanted in ecstatic unison, a low susurration that made the stones tremble. At the palace steps, the governor, or the thing he had become, stood at the head of an elaborate procession. He wore a crown of horns, and nothing else but swirling body paint and blood. In his hands, he held a large chalice that glinted black in the dim light. Beside him was the towering form of the Emperor's children champion I had seen before, resplendent in his gaudy armor, arms raised to conduct this horrid ritual. Flanking them were demonettes, capering and preening, and other high-ranking cultists. I even spotted the golden form of the living Venus being carried on a palanquin, her eyes vacant with rapture as worshippers bowed before her like she was an idol. The ritual was reaching its peak. I could feel it like a pressure on my skull. The air tasted of ozone and sugar, nauseatingly sweet. Bolts of warp energy occasionally cracked above the crowd, sending showers of pink lightning arcing harmlessly down. The governor began to speak, his voice amplified unnaturally, probably through the warp or the noise marine's sonic devices, such that it echoed across the plaza and beyond. I could hear it clearly even in my hiding spot. "Children of excess, the Dark Prince hears our cry. On this night, we transcend the last boundaries. On this night, the veil between pleasure and pain, reality and rapture shall be torn asunder. Rejoice, rejoice, for he comes among us." The crowd erupted in delirious cheers and screams. The governor lifted the chalice high. I could see it was overflowing with a swirling mixture, blood, wine, and other fluids I dared not imagine. At a signal, a line of prisoners, the few still living captives or perhaps volunteers willing to die, was brought forth by masked attendants. One by one, these were slaughtered with ceremonial blades, their lifeblood pouring into great bowls that then were emptied into the governor's chalice, consecrating the concoction with fresh sacrifice. I pressed a fist to my mouth, forcing myself not to scream or vomit. It was almost over, I told myself. One way or another, this had to be the final act. The Space Marine, the champion, stepped forward and took the brimming chalice from the governor. He bellowed a proclamation in a language I didn't understand, perhaps the dark tongue of chaos. Then, raising the chalice, he drank deeply from it. The viscous, sanguine mix overflowed, running down over his armor. The crowd went silent in awe. He raised his arms, and I saw his eyes roll back, his body shudder. A warp wind whipped through the plaza, extinguishing many torches. Those strange witch lights immediately sprang up to take their place, dancing above the masses. The Marine threw his head back and roared a single word, loud and resonant. A name, perhaps. Slaanesh. At that moment, reality buckled. The immense statue at the plaza's center began to glow from within, as if an inner fire had been lit. The chanting resumed, faster and more frenzied. The noise, Marines, there were several now, I realized, a half dozen in a line, struck up a cacophonous hymn on their hellish instruments, amplifiers booming. The music was at once seductive and horrifying, each note a needle in my spine, yet pulling at my senses. Above, the boiling sky cracked open with a peal of thunder, but there was no rain. Instead, a rent in the heavens formed, a swirl of iridescent light. From this tear dripped tendrils of darkness and color, the warp made manifest, reaching down like eager fingers. I felt a hideous presence approaching from that rift. My instincts screamed to run, to get as far away as possible, but there was nowhere to go. The entire horizon was lighting up with warp storm energy. The crowd in the plaza was in ecstasy. Many were prostrating, offering themselves utterly. I saw some climbing the statue, clawing at it, tearing their own flesh in supplication. Daemonetses pranced and leapt, their laughter ringing out. The governor was dancing in mad pirouettes, while the champion space marine knelt, arms outstretched to the heavens, awaiting his dark god's arrival. This was it. They were actually doing it. They were pulling She Who Thirsts, Slaanesh, or at least a significant shard of its power, directly into our reality. The thought chilled me to the marrow. A chaos god manifest, even for a moment, would utterly damn this world, as if it wasn't already, and maybe beyond. And I would likely cease to exist in any meaningful way, soul devoured in an instant by that endless appetite. Oddly, that realization calmed me. There was no action I could take to change anything now. I was a spectator to the apocalypse, powerless but strangely composed in the face of inevitability. Perhaps because deep down, I knew the Imperium would never allow such a thing to stand, not without answer. If any part of the Emperor's might still could reach us, it would be now or never. As if on cue, a new light bloomed on the horizon, but it was not the sickly glow of chaos. It was harsh, brilliant, pure. For a split second, my jaded mind thought, sunrise? But no, this light was rising from the edge of the sky, not from the distant sun, which was entirely blotted out by storm. A shrill alarm went up from some in the crowd. They sensed something amiss, something outside their script. The champion stood, looking about wildly, as if sensing a new presence, but not from the warp tear above. Then came the sound, a whistling, keening sound that grew louder by the second. Those few of us with any sanity left recognized it, the descent of something terrible and swift from the heavens. Exterminatus! In the last fraction of a moment, I understood. The Imperium had indeed not forgotten us. They had likely monitored from afar, unable or unwilling to intervene directly against the warp infestation. But now, on this night of our greatest heresy, they chose to end Calypso's misery, the only way left, by purging it completely. A cyclonic torpedo or some other ultimate sanction was already screaming down through the atmosphere. I had time for one last thought, a brief, hysterical mix of gratitude and sorrow. Thank you, and goodbye. I clutched the Aquila pendant at my neck. I had never let it go through all of this, and pressed it to my lips. The world turned white. A spear of incandescent fury plunged into the city center as the orbital payload struck. In an instant, the great statue, the governor, the champion, and tens of thousands of worshippers were vaporized, their ecstatic cries silenced in a flash of superheated air. I was 2 kilometers away, yet the blast wave hit me like the fist of a Gaur. The building I sheltered in disintegrated. I was blown off my feet like a leaf in a hurricane, tumbling through a vortex of ash and filth. I don't know how long I was insensate. It could not have been more than a few heartbeats, but it felt like an eternity of pure brightness and noise. My eyes, though clenched shut, saw only white. My ears rang with a sound beyond volume, beyond pain, the sound of judgment. When I came back to myself, I was on the ground, perhaps a block from where I had been. My clothes were smoking, skin seared in places by heat, though miraculously not outright charred. All around me, buildings were sheared off, trees incinerated, the very ground scorched to glass in patches. A hot gale, the aftershock of the impact, was howling through the skeletal remains of the city, throwing embers and debris in every direction. High above, the warp rift that had been opening was gone, completely overwhelmed by the detonation's energy. The unnatural darkness was replaced by a roiling wall of dust and fire encompassing the sky. No sign of the chaos god's manifestation remained. Whatever nascent portal they'd opened had been utterly blown out. I tasted ash and copper in my mouth. Every breath hurt. The air was scorching, filled with particles. With effort, I rolled onto my back and looked towards the plaza. There was nothing but a crater and flames. The fires were strange, some purple, some ordinary orange, but they were rapidly blending into a single immense conflagration that devoured everything. Tiny flitting shapes that must have been demonettes or other warp spawn flickered around the flames, wailing, and winked out one by one as reality reasserted itself with brutal finality. I could faintly hear, under the roar of destruction, the collective scream of agony and rage from what remained of the cultists across the city. It was strangely short-lived. Either the firestorm consumed them, or the shock broke their minds swiftly. Perhaps both. I found I could not move much. My right leg was broken from the blast, twisted under me. Oddly, I felt no pain from it yet. Perhaps my body was too full of adrenaline or simply numb. I lay there, watching the apocalypse unfold. The exterminatus was not yet complete. One blast would not finish an entire world. But I knew the pattern. They'd likely dropped multiple warheads across major sites, or would follow up with virus bombs, or more fire to scour every inch. Indeed, in the distance toward the spaceport, another brilliant flash signaled a second impact, and another towards the eastern seaport. Calypso was being scoured clean. My eyes stung from the brightness, and I closed them, tears evaporating on my cheeks as soon as they formed. Surprisingly, I was crying not from sorrow, but from an overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. Emperor, forgive me, but in that moment I felt such sweet release. The nightmare was ending. Not in the way any of us had wanted, but ending all the same. All those lost souls, all that depravity, would soon be nothing more than cinders on the cosmic wind, and my own suffering and guilt and terror would be buried in the ashes. I coughed and tasted blood. My lungs were likely scorched. I probably didn't have long, I realized distantly. The firestorm would reach me soon if my injuries didn't finish the job first. But there was no fear in that realization, only peace. Real peace this time, not the false kind whispered by a demon. The Emperor had granted me mercy in the only way left. I struggled to retrieve something from the tattered remains of my pocket, a small item I had kept hidden. The old locket that Marielle gave me ages ago, a tiny cameo of the Emperor's sigil. Somehow it was still intact. I clutched it to my chest and found myself praying. Perhaps no one could hear me in this inferno, but I prayed anyway, for my soul, for the souls of all on this world, even those who had damned themselves. The Emperor's light will take what it can, and the rest will be the devil's. A hot wind washed over me, and through my cracked eyelids I saw a wall of flame sweeping down the boulevard. It was beautiful in a way, a cleansing light consuming the filth and horror. Within that blaze, for just an instant, I fancied I saw shapes, perhaps figures in golden armor, walking toward me. The hallucination comforted me. I smiled faintly at the thought that the Emperor's angels might be here to escort a foolish girl home. The heat grew intense. My skin was blistering, but the pain was distant now. I couldn't even hear anything but a dull thrum. My hearing gone, or just overtaken by the roar of the fire. I took my last look at the world. The once grand city of Calypso was a silhouette against a horizon of flame. The pleasure world turned hell was finally dying. I wondered at the end if in some strange way the Emperor had answered the Dark Prince, one final act of absolute unforgiving purgation to deny Slaanesh its prize. A draw, perhaps, or a victory for humanity at great cost. That was not for me to decide. My vision wavered. The flames were all around now, a curtain of light. It didn't hurt anymore. In fact, it felt warm and almost tender, like the embrace of an old friend. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard singing. Not the depraved songs of the cult, but something else. Perhaps a trick of my dying mind. It sounded like a choir, gentle and pure, carrying a hymn I dimly recalled from childhood. How did it go? Though darkness surrounds, the Emperor's light will guide. Something like that. Fitting, I supposed. I closed my eyes, clutching the locket, and let the fire wash over me. My lips moved in a silent final prayer. Emperor, receive me. And then, at long last, I knew no more.